What's up, everybody? Welcome along again. Thank you so much again for joining. So many of you here so early again, chatting all afternoon. I've loved it. I've dipped in and out myself. I really, honestly, genuinely appreciate the effort you guys go to and this little community that we're building here. So brilliant. Thank you very much. Welcome along, everybody, wherever you are, all over the world. Hi, Ernie D from Sydney over in Australia. Goodness knows what time it is there, but thank you very much. Good morning from Alaska, Harrison Alga. Thank you very much. Good evening, Rob Simpson. Are you kidding me? No sound. There is sound. You're winding me up. Don't do this to me every week. Don't do this, you lot, you cheeky bunch. Yes, Ryan Collins, I'm hiding my hair. I know, Finley, haircuts needed. I might get round to it this week. Yeah, thanks very much for the wind up. You got me good and proper on the sound, but there you go. It's my own fault for messing it up so often in the early days. Anyway, should we get into it? What do you think of the race this weekend? I'd love to know, because I'm a bit sort of mixed up as to what sort of race that was, because I mean, I was glued to the set all the way through. I couldn't sort of take my eye off it. As always, it had interesting moments, didn't it? It had some really spicy moments. The first corner was great. It was the Valtteri Bottas we've been screaming out to see for so long in that first corner, but then it all faded away. And, you know, we'll talk about the safety car. We've got questions on that, of course. There were loads of things that happened throughout the race, but was it a good race? It didn't feel like it was exciting all the way through. So I'm not sure, but anyway, let me know. Boring, says Adam Elliott, although Clansom said it was good. Good race, says Anoop Baines. Yeah, it was one of those, exactly. I think it was a bit of a mix. Josh Smith, decent race. Pirate Ninja says, cancel Friday practice forever. Well, that's another good point, isn't it? The Friday practice, I thought actually was a kind of an interesting experiment. On a circuit that nobody was really very familiar with, not for, you know, since 2013 as F1 raced there. A couple of drivers had raced in the past, but nothing of any relevance. They didn't have any relevant data. And to go through all of Friday without gaining any of that was a bit of an experiment ahead of course, what we'll have in Imola. In fact, in Imola, we'll get another half an hour of practice on Saturday morning to compensate that we didn't get here. So I thought it was quite interesting, and you know, it didn't spoil the show. I'm not sure it added a huge amount to the show, but I don't think it took anything away. And one thing I think we have too much of in modern Formula One, and this might sound weird coming from me because I'm all about this kind of thing, the engineering side of stuff. I think we have too much data and too much ability to play with that data and get it back to the factory and spend all of Friday night running cars on a simulator with a driver in the loop, going through all the possible scenarios that may have played out or they might want to play out on Saturday. And of course, we couldn't do that this week because there was no new data to feed into that simulator system on Friday night. So I thought it was cool. I thought it was a good weekend, interesting from lots of different angles, as I say. And yeah, I mean, let's talk about the race, because we should start by showing some respect for what Lewis Hamilton achieved this weekend. 91 race victories, and you know, I know that we have more races in the season this time around in the modern era compared to what Schumacher did. I know that Lewis has, at the moment, the best car, absolutely, but he deserves to be in that car. I won't take anything away from Lewis's 91 wins. I remember the very first one back in Montreal in 2007. I was, of course, there for it. It was a very special day because I think we knew that this kid had burst onto the scene that had surprised everybody. Nobody more so than us in that McLaren garage were surprised as much as anybody else with just how quick he was. And yet I thought, you know, going on from that moment onwards, all these years later, to 91 wins, you've got to have respect for him. You know, the best drivers end up in the best cars. Schumacher, for much of his career, had the best car. He had a huge number of advantages, you know, playing in his favour as well, with Bridgestone tyres and all sorts of other things. You can reflect on various FIA decisions that maybe went for him that didn't go for others. There are so many things that you can all play into the picture to say Schumacher had advantages, but he deserved those advantages because he earned his right to be in that car, and that's exactly the same as Lewis Hamilton. And the one thing, you know, I did a video on this recently, a Tales from the Treehouse episode, if you remember. I think it was called something like Lewis's First Days as a Formula One driver. Check it out later if you want. But those first days when we were first introduced to Lewis as a Formula One driver back then, as a rookie, who no one really had too much confidence in his very first year, if I'm really honest. What stood out about Lewis was his work ethic, his desire to understand every little intricate detail about the car, about the engineering process, looking at every single thing that could make him better. Every day, every minute of every day, staying there till the very end of the night, till he was kicked out of the engineering offices. And from what I understand, talking to people at Mercedes today, he's exactly the same. With 91 wins under his belt and a 6-time world champion, he's exactly the same. And that's why I have developed over the years an incredible respect for him. So I won't take anybody saying that he doesn't deserve them, because he absolutely does. So there we go. That's my tipping of the hat to Lewis Hamilton. It was an amazing achievement and touching moment, of course, from Mick Schumacher to hand over the Michael Schumacher crash helmet post-race as well. So I thought it was a great weekend that should be that achievement should be celebrated. It's not that he's now suddenly a better driver than Schumacher. It's not that his record's going to be better in the end or worse, because you can't really compare drivers from different eras. But taking Lewis as a standalone driver, he is very special, and we all need to give a little bit of respect for that. So there we go. Let's move on from there, and we'll talk about the race, because there were a number of things that cropped up in the race, a number of talking points. Bottas, let's start with that one, that first corner. He got his elbows out. You know, we all looked at that. I'm sure we all looked at that and thought, right, Lewis has got that. Lewis has got the first corner. The race is probably over because Lewis has done him off the line. He's got into turn 1 first. But Bottas wasn't having it. You know, well off the circuit. I mean, on another day, you'd have all been penalised for that. But it was the first corner, overtaking off the circuit. But he kept his foot in, he kept his elbows out, and he pushed Lewis back. And that is exactly what we need from Valtteri. That's what Valtteri needs to do, because what happened then was he got himself in front. He managed to get that lead. He actually did a really good job of breaking DRS and maintaining the DRS gap over Lewis, which is really important for that first stint. And then it all went wrong through a mistake. And, you know, there was a question that came in earlier. I don't think I grabbed that one, but somebody said, did Lewis Hamilton push Valtteri into that mistake? I mean, he did to some extent, of course. Valtteri was under pressure, and that's what you've got to do when you're chasing in second or behind. You have to continually maintain the pressure, because that might be your only hope on some occasions, is hoping that someone's going to make a mistake like that. So anyway, it's a shame for Valtteri that he couldn't hang on to it, but perhaps symptomatic of the relationship between the two and where the two of them stand in that team and in this championship. And ultimately, despite some brilliant showings right at the beginning of the race, it was Lewis that came out on top again. Right, let's see what you're saying before we get into some of these questions. Andy Salmon, yes, but Elvis, he shit his pants on lap 13 with a bit of pressure when Lewis stepped it up. Exactly. He did shit his pants. Yeah, he did. And you can't afford to do that if you want to be world champion. Yeah, Bottas couldn't handle the pressure that was gaining on him. Absolutely. That is the problem ultimately, isn't it? He couldn't maintain that. And that, I guess, is where the difference between the two is. Lewis very rarely caves under pressure. He very rarely makes mistakes. And that's what brings him wins and world championships. Anyway, let's see. What else have we got here? Hail Holy Bacon says, Mark, I was 10 minutes late. Can you start over? Don't worry, man, you haven't missed much. We're just talking about Lewis's achievements, but now we'll get into the race and the questions, because let me pick up on the questions. I've just realised I've left the question on screen all this time. I didn't mean to do that, but let's start with it. Sean Fennon says, why do you think we had a full safety car and not a virtual safety car when Lando Norris stopped next to recovery area and stewards area? Is this a sport or entertainment? And that is a question echoed by many of you. Over the course of the weekend. Sunday night, my timeline was full of people questioning that full safety car. And look, there is definitely, I think unquestionably, there is now a feeling within the FIA, or feeling within fans, that the FIA are taking a slightly different stance this year, in that they seem a little bit more happy to throw a full safety car when previously they may well have started to use the virtual safety car for more incidents like that. The one with Lando's car, I mean, Michael Massey has come out and explained it today. It's difficult to argue with his reasoning behind it. You know, if he'd thrown a virtual safety car, you'd have gone, yeah, fair enough. That's a decent decision. He threw a full safety car, and yes, of course, it closes up the field, and we'll get into the length of the safety car in a moment, but it closes up the field. It brings the race alive again a little bit. Now, you can argue that that's artificially inducing entertainment when those guys at the front that had built the lead up thoroughly deserved that lead. They'd worked hard for it. And that's how I would feel if I was still working for a team. I absolutely agree. So are they just throwing the full safety cars for entertainment's perspective? Well, I think there might be some element of that. We've got to keep the show alive. You know, this is a sport, but it's also a huge entertainment business. But on the flip side of Michael Massey's reasoning for throwing the full safety car, it's also difficult to argue with that, because Lando's car was sat there. It was close to an exit, but he says they weren't quite sure whether they could fit that through the gap. I'm not sure I buy that one, because actually those gaps, as I've explained on this channel before, are already predestined right throughout the race director's notes, pre-race, as to which ones you can take a car through and which ones you can't. I actually haven't checked to see which one that is, but I'm assuming that's one where you can get a car through. So I don't necessarily buy that one, but his other argument was the car was on fire, or it was burning. The bodywork was burning. It was looking like it was about to catch fire. If it had caught fire, you would certainly need a lot more marshals on the scene in between the race car and the racetrack, putting that fire out. And that would have been dangerous to have cars still travelling around the racetrack like that. So there is an argument to say that there is a safety side of this, and from that perspective, it's difficult to argue with Massey's comments. So I think it's one of those that it could have gone either way, but actually when it can go either way and you can spice up the show, they seem very happy to throw a full safety car these days. That would be my opinion. Let's see what you're saying. Well, Clansom says Jules Bianchi, and that is exactly my point there. That's why it's difficult to argue with the safety aspect of that kind of decision, because there's a car smouldering away. There will have to be marshals on the circuit. It only takes one driver to have another problem with his car, for example, or to be just, you know, going too quickly, or to disconnect the virtual safety car, or not fall within his virtual safety car delta, for example, have a puncture or have a failure on the car where he could spin out and end up in that same gravel trap. So unlikely, but look, that's a very good point from Clansom. The Jules Bianchi incident means that it's now very difficult to argue with anything that's protecting the driver's safety or the safety of the marshals at the circuit. Lando still in his chair. That was a nice moment, wasn't it? Lando taking over the deck chair from Fernando Alonso. I think he knew exactly what he was doing when he sat in that chair. But gutting for Lando, I have to say, because he was on for a really strong finish, I thought. So a real shame for him that he didn't manage to finish that race, because, you know, he was in a fight with Daniel Ricciardo for that final podium position. He was on a different strategy to Daniel Ricciardo. Not quite sure how it would have worked out. I think Daniel probably still had the pace, but it might have been close. So a real shame for them. And they say that the problem was exactly the same problem that they had with Carlos Sainz's car at the beginning of whichever race he couldn't start, whichever that one was recently. Where he never got out of the garage. So it's an ignition problem and unburnt fuel going into the exhaust, causing misfires and disaster ultimately. There we go. Right. Safety first, says John Stout. Absolutely. Given Merc's advantage, safety cars are the only way to ensure not everyone gets lapped. Rafi Chowdhury. Well, I mean, that is the point. The race was so spaced out yesterday because the leaders had opened up such a lead. There was such a gap between the top, I don't know, 5, I think it was, wasn't it? And the rest. That, yeah, on one hand, it becomes a dull show from a TV perspective, from an entertainment perspective. But then equally, that's also the reason why the safety car ended up taking so long. Because as soon as you take the decision to allow lapped cars to unlap themselves, there were so many lapped cars in that race at that point that it took forever to get them all past, and then they allowed them to go a long way round, which was at the race director's discretion. And you could argue that perhaps the safety car stayed out a little bit too long, but it was always going to be a long hold up like that because there were so many cars that had already been lapped. There we go. Right, why not fit the car through the fence? Well, they were. That was the intention, was to fit the car through the fence, but it was burning. They weren't sure when they threw it whether they were going to have to, you know, bring fire marshals on to put it out, and they weren't even sure whether they could have rolled it through the fence, through that gap. So they ended up making the decision to crane it off in case it caught fire, and the safety car came out in case they had to bring fire marshals on, is my understanding. Right, let's move it on. What else have we got? All right, this was a question about the Bottas mistake. Do you think that Lewis contributed to Bottas' driving fault, or was it just tyres going off? Well, it was both. So that was the question I thought I couldn't find earlier. Thank you, Sean. Yes, well, it was both. So Lewis's pressure absolutely forced Bottas into the mistake, but equally, Lewis had done a really good job of looking after his tyres, much better job than Valtteri had done. And as soon as you get that graining, and to explain, I think I may have done a video on this. If not, I will definitely do a video on graining, because graining is this phenomenon that occurs with tyres, particularly in low temperatures like that, where the core of the tyre warms up at a different rate to the surface, the tread of the tyre. When it's very difficult to get core temperature in, as soon as you start racing, of course, the frictional forces acting on the tyre surface generate massive amounts of heat just at the top layer. And the very top layer of rubber essentially turns into grains of rubber. It rolls off into tiny little baubles, a little bit like when you drag a pencil eraser across a desk at school and you get those tiny little baubles roll off. That is the graining phenomenon. Now, you can imagine a Formula One tyre is relying on those 4 contact patches for all of its grip. Imagine all of a sudden where those 4 contact patches, or at least 2 of them, turn into tiny little balls of rubber. What's going to happen? You immediately slide off the circuit. And of course, when you start to do that, you exacerbate the problem. So graining is a massive issue, and it shouldn't be underestimated that when that happens, the effect is huge. I mean, you lose control of your car, you lose all grip, and then it becomes very difficult to build that temperature back up. So what Lewis managed to do was build that temperature up in a much more uniform, even way over the first few laps of the race, and prevent the graining being as bad as it was on Valtteri's car. Lewis even said he could see that phase that Valtteri was going through ahead of him, so knew he was going to have an opportunity when Valtteri started to really suffer with that, and that's exactly what happened. So the answer to your question, Sean, is that both of those things happened and contributed to that. But ultimately, both of those reasons still fall to Valtteri's responsibility to deal with. He has to deal with the pressure, and he also has to deal with a known graining phase that was going to be a problem over the course of this weekend in such very cold temperatures. Bottas race makes me appreciate what Rosberg achieved so much more and understand why he retired after his championship, says Rafi Chowdhury. That's a good point. I think, you know, different eras, different times, of course, again, but what Nico did was exactly what Valtteri needs to do now, which was get nasty, get dirty, get his elbows out, you know, dig deeper in himself, for, like Lewis is doing, for every little opportunity and advantage. And it seems like Valtteri's squandering some of those at the moment. Yes, he's had a bit of bad luck as well, of course, and that certainly doesn't help. But you're exactly right. Rosberg managed to get everything working right on that particular year, together with a bit of good luck for him and some bad luck for Lewis, and that's how a championship is often won. DAS ban will be a great loss for Marc next year, says Mario L. Well, it will be a loss, absolutely. How big a loss is slightly unknown, because it's a bit of an unquantifiable thing for us just watching on. Only the team will know just how much of an advantage they're able to achieve from that. Certainly this weekend, I would have expected it to be a big advantage in terms of generating temperature. So either increasing the toe out angle to create scrub, or it depends which way they have it set up, or to bring the tyres into a toe in angle that's more extreme, again to scrub tyres and generate temperature in those fronts, where without that it's much harder to build up that temperature throughout the tyre. So the DAS at certain weekends is a huge advantage. I don't think they'll have had enough opportunity to really maximise what's capable with DAS because of the limited running we've had this year, the limited testing, going to new venues where they haven't really had an opportunity to spend too much time on that. And of course it's going next year. So in terms of its development as a tech product, that will be on hold, I guess. So it's a brilliant idea. It's an ingenious solution. I think it's a bit of a shame that we're not going to see that developed, because I think it's just brilliant. I love it. Gust says the DAS worked. See the restart of Lewis. Absolutely, agree totally. Let me see. Hulk. Let's see this. Oh, here we go. We've got a question on Hulk. Let's bring that one up, and then we'll get on to Albon after that. But Jamie Zach says, question mark, what? And actually, he came back to me later on Twitter and corrected the spelling of my name. So I appreciate that, Jamie. Thank you. What's the chances of the Hulk getting a seat for 2021, considering the possible congestion? And that is a really good point, because let's talk about what Hulk did this weekend, which will have done him no harm at all in his quest to get back on the grid for 2021. Saturday morning, of course, we all know the story. He's sat there having coffee with a mate, thinking he's going to leisurely drive his way to the circuit for a TV gig with RTL, who, by the way, must be getting really pissed off that he's got this contract to present for RTL and keeps getting keeps getting trumped by having to be called in on by a team. Jack Jones, woolly hat indoors, get your heating on. Yeah, I know, it's mostly to hide the mop of hair, I'll be perfectly honest, but there you go. I've just come in from the cold as well. Hulk though, so he got to the circuit, he jumped in the car, he had something like, what, four laps of quali. Qualified last. You could look at that and go, well, he's got a car capable of much more than that, but he didn't manage to do it. But in 4 laps, that's a really tall order, a big ask to manage to achieve anything much more than that. But what was most impressive, of course, was how he moved forward in the race, when he'd had the Saturday night to get his thoughts together, to go through things like the steering wheel functions, gather his thoughts, speak to the engineers, work out a plan, prepare himself mentally. And you saw what he did, managed to get himself up to 8th position and into the point. So really good job. One thing that I only found out today, I didn't realise, I'm not sure if this came up over the weekend and maybe I missed it, but Helmut Marko had already been in touch with Hulk when one of Alex Albon's initial COVID tests came back as inconclusive. And at that point, of course, the team slightly panicked, scrabbling around for a possible replacement, and it was Hülkenberg, interestingly, that they called. So they had a conversation. Of course, Albon later then tested negative and was able to continue over the weekend. But it just shows you how highly Red Bull and Helmut Marko already rate Nico Hülkenberg. Yes, of course, he's one of few drivers with experience who's available, but the fact that he jumped on the phone to him shows you there have already conversations that have happened. So I think Hülkenberg, to answer your question, Jamie, I think the chances of him being on the grid next year are reasonable, and probably more reasonable now after the back of 2 solid weekends in a car. 3, in fact, isn't it now? 2.5. When he showed what he can do, and everybody, of course, has seen that. So where could he go? I think Red Bull is a genuine possibility, and that will lead us on to the Alex Albon question in a moment. I think there's obviously seats at Haas. I strongly feel now that the Kimi situation at Alfa Romeo, perhaps alongside Mick Schumacher, is looking more and more likely. Kimi just has a few things to make his mind up on. He's looking for some kind of assurances that there is enough budget at Alfa to, first of all, pay him, but secondly, to develop the car throughout the season as well, so that he knows that there's opportunity to move forward and develop. And then I think he will sign a contract, is my understanding. Mick Schumacher, I think, is certainly the most likely. A real shame for him he didn't get a chance to run out in the car this week. But if he can continue his form in F2 and take that championship, I think it's very difficult to look beyond him for that opportunity. Which means that there's the seats at Haas with the potential for Nico Hülkenberg. But more interestingly is this Renault seat. So before I get on to Alex Albon, the question on Alex and perhaps Hülkenberg at Red Bull, just let's talk about Hülkenberg and what you thought about him, where you think he should go, because I thought it was a really strong, solid performance. He made a couple of little errors, but that's perhaps expected. I'll tell you what surprised me, actually. In fact, I was really quite surprised at this, that given the issues that Racing Point had earlier in the year when they had to call on Hülkenberg, how was it still at this point they don't have a reserve, whether that's Hülkenberg or anyone else, on standby at the circuit, fully prepared. I don't understand how every team isn't in that situation. Mercedes have Stoffel Van Dorn. They have them in the vicinity. They can't actually come in. Stoffel can't come into the circuit because he can't come into the F1 bubble, but he's in the vicinity at a hotel, having been in the simulator, having learnt the steering wheel, knowing exactly what he's got to do, being part of the engineering meetings, you know, over the radio, over the headset, all the way through the build-up to a weekend. That's being prepared. And I'm really surprised that every team isn't in that situation, because a positive COVID test, or anything else for that matter, can occur at really short notice. And for somebody like Racing Point, when they're in this intense battle in the championship, particularly with McLaren and Renault who are on the rise, Hülkenberg's 8th place was great, but the fact that he only qualified last, being so underprepared on Saturday, well, maybe he could have qualified well into the top 10, somewhere close to Perez, had he been there and been ready and prepared. So I feel like it's a bit of an oversight from a Formula One team that very rarely have much oversight on anything like that. So, you know, I think, I wonder if that will change moving forward, whether they'll give Hülkenberg an official reserve driver contract and have him on standby all the time. Have him, you know, as a day in the simulator in the build up to a race, having part of those meetings. It seems sensible to me. Let me see. Mayo Man says, Hulk top performance, qualified 3rd in Silverstone. Absolutely. If not Hulk, it would have been Van Dorn. Yeah, I mean, but that's the point. So Van Dorn is the Mercedes reserve driver who is available to Racing Point, but he's not been in the Racing Point. He's not been in the Racing Point simulator. He's not familiar with the Racing Point setup or steering wheel, no more so, in fact less so than Nico Hülkenberg is. So they've got Van Dorn there, but they chose not to use him because they had somebody who was slightly more experienced, and yet not experienced enough with the modern car, the current car and technology, to be able to jump straight in it and do a better job than qualifying last on Saturday. So I don't blame Nico for that at all, but I feel like it's an oversight for the team. Let me see. What if 2 of the current drivers need replacing? Fight for Hülkenberg. Yeah, I mean, seems like the go-to man, doesn't he? Some teams have this covered, others clearly definitely don't. Right, the Hulk should be in F1, and if he isn't next season, it'll be extremely wrong, says John Stout. I mean, I kind of agree with you. I agree with you to some extent because he's a great driver. Does he deserve it more than somebody like a Mick Schumacher or a Callum Ilott who are on their way up, the next generation? I mean, that's another question entirely. There are lots of drivers who deserve a seat, but there are more drivers that deserve a seat than there are seats available. So I guess somebody has to fall by the wayside, I guess. Right, there we go. Let's see. A lot of F1 personnel have tested positive, apparently, says Josh Smith. Well, a lot more than previous weeks. And I guess that's not too much of a surprise now that we've moved into a phase of the season where we're doing a race and then we have a weekend off and then we go back to a race. Because at that point, everybody's going home. They're sort of moving around freely. They get out of the bubble and move around in normal life, and then they come back. So perhaps not a surprise that the rate of infection within the paddock has crept up a little bit. I mean, it's not huge, but it's definitely more than it was earlier in the season. I'd like to see Hulk, but he had 10 years in F1, says Charlie. I mean, that's the thing. He's had a good stint. You could say the same for Kimi. I mean, Kimi's had, almost 20 years in the sport now. You could say that, you know, it's time for him to move on. Or lots of people will say he still deserves a seat because he brings a lot to the sport. So there's always arguments for and against, absolutely. Let me see. Hang on. Let me see. Trying to get a question answered when Marc looks up is harder than winning a title. What you want to say, John? John Webster. I mean, there's a lot of questions. I'm doing my best. Hulk should not drive for any team next year. Keep him on standby for all of them, says Pan Dim. Well, he's in danger of becoming the perennial reserve driver, isn't he, I guess, in that sense. But I do think there's an opportunity. So let's move on to the Red Bull question, because I think this kind of links in quite nicely. This one comes from Helga Kuistra, who says, can Red Bull continue with Albon? half a second off in quali and 1 second off in race pace. And now complaining over the radio about AlphaTauri drivers, they race me so hard. I'm not sure that was a wise comment, was it? I mean, it's obvious it was going to make it to the radio because the TV director loves stuff like that. And that won't help his cause at all. Alex Albon had well, let's be honest, he had a difficult weekend. Really poor weekend. Thanks, John. Yeah, but what's your question? Give us a question. I see you. Give us a question, I'll answer it for you. I'll do my best. Alex Albon had a really, I thought, disappointing weekend where, you know, I'm standing behind Alex Albon in that I know he's a great, talented driver. We all know that because he's done great things on the way to F1. He hasn't suddenly lost his talent, but how long do you stand behind a driver that's costing your team massively? I mean, all right, Red Bull are in this slightly, you know, fortunate position in that they're not being challenged really from behind. They've got no hope of challenging the guys in front of them. So they can afford, I guess, to be a little bit more lenient or a little bit more patient with Alex because it may not cost them a championship. It's certainly costing them points. It's certainly costing them prize money. And, you know, whilst I thought they've been way too hasty in years gone by with drivers, piling too much pressure on and then making those drivers almost fall apart emotionally and psychologically with that pressure, firing them midway through the season. And they've done the opposite now with Alex, which I respect. But at some point, the driver has to step up and deliver what Max is proving is capable of the car. So Helga, your question there, how long can they stick with him? I honestly think they'll stick with him to the end of this season because I feel like that's the right thing to do in this particular year, in 2020, when they can afford to do that. See if they can unlock something from him. And actually, I don't think they've got anyone on their Red Bull program, you know, aside from Gasly, who they've tried and it didn't work out in that Red Bull environment for him either. So perhaps the answer then, and this comes back to Hulkenberg, is to maybe look outside the Red Bull driver program and bring someone else in. And if you're going to do that, you've got Hulkenberg and Perez both now available for next year. That's an interesting prospect, isn't it? And quite a tough call. I mean, who would you choose out of the two, Checo or Hulkenberg? I'm not sure because I think they both bring a huge amount of experience. They're both a pretty steady pair of hands. You know, neither of them, I would say, are world champion material. They're not setting the world alight and they're not people that you would say he's the next future world champion. But Red Bull already have that in Max Verstappen. What they need is someone to be there, dependable every week, to bring up the second car, if you like, and coming in just behind Max, challenging him, pushing him, being there when Max can't finish a race to take the podium spot, those kind of things. That's what they need from their second driver. And ultimately, Alex Albon just isn't doing that right now. So let's see what you guys are saying. Bottas and Albon to a tandem Deliveroo bike. Thanks, Andy Lowe. Get that off and running. Checo to Haas, Hulk to Red Bull, and Mick to Sauber, Anko. I think that's not a bad shout, and I actually think that could happen. I think Checo could go to Haas. I do think that there's a chance Hulkenberg could go to Red Bull. I don't think that's out of the question. And Mick Schumacher to Sauber, to Alfa Romeo. I think you may well have struck that one right, struck the gold there. Checo is quick. He is. Checo is quick. I totally agree with you, but so is Hulk. Let me see. Well, you have nothing to lose when you move Albon out now, says Mario. Well, you don't have anything to lose in terms of the championship, but what if they can manage to unlock some potential from Alex? Like I said before, he hasn't lost his talent. He's just not found a way to unlock his potential with that of the potential of that particular car. A little bit like Gasly. He couldn't do it in a Red Bull either. He's gone back to, you know, Toro Rosso, AlphaTauri, and he has unlocked the potential of himself with that particular car in a different environment. So is it the car? Is it the Red Bull racing environment as opposed to the AlphaTauri environment? And if it is, Red Bull need to find the solutions to those problems, because if that's how it's going to be, and they're constantly looking for another Max Verstappen. Another Max Verstappen isn't going to come along every year or every couple of years. They may not have another one on that Red Bull conveyor belt, so perhaps they've got to look somewhere else. Perez is North American, so Haas would like that, says Grover Clark. Agree. I think he's a good fit for Haas. I do think that's not a bad shout. Danny Rick to stay at Renault. Let me see. I think Perez might leave for IndyCar. Albon will stay at Red Bull, and Hulk would be a good call for Haas. Perez could go to IndyCar. That is another really good fit for him if he can't. I think he preferred to stay in F1. If he can't, IndyCar's a good shout. Is RB toxic, says Mayo Man. Well, we've spoken about this before. I don't think it's toxic, but I do think if you've grown up on that Red Bull driver program, seeing the guys that get put up against Max, not even making it through a whole season, getting binned off halfway through a season and very publicly demoted, because that's what it is, isn't it? There's a huge amount of pressure, and that's not conducive to getting the best out of human performance. And being a Formula One driver, you're an athlete. You need the very best of everything to get the best out of you. The best physical training, the best mental state, psychological state, the best environment around you, the best people around you. You know, it's a no-brainer. You need all of those things. I don't think Red Bull provide that necessarily, or have provided that in the past. And I think that's one of the elements that isn't working for somebody like Alex Albon. Do you think the Red Bull's too geared towards Max? I don't buy this. I don't buy that they've built a car so much around Max that no one else can drive it. You know, they've built a car that's got some slightly different characteristics to a number of other cars on the grid, absolutely. And Max, either he suits that or he's adapted to that very well. That high rake of that car is pretty extreme. They are the team that pioneered that concept, and therefore they're probably ahead of everyone else in terms of getting that to work. But there are some pretty unique characteristics around that concept as well, about how you get the best out of it. So maybe it's very different to just getting into a racing car that all of these kids have grown up racing over the years, even very different to the AlphaTauri or the Toro Rosso, and therefore it's not just as straightforward as getting out of one and getting into another. So I don't know, I think it's a difficult situation that Red Bull have created for themselves, and now they need to find a way around it. One thing you would do by bringing in a Hülkenberg is you perhaps alleviate some of that pressure where you've not got a young kid fighting for his career, thinking that he may not make it through a season. You've got one of the most experienced guys in Formula One who's there in what he knows will be his last shot in the sport. So perhaps that is the answer for them. Right. Should they promote Gasly again? I mean, look, on one side of things, Gasly has done everything he needs to do to get another shot at it. But from a Red Bull perspective, what do? Do you keep bringing these guys up? Maybe they fail in that Red Bull environment that I've just talked about, and then you put them back down again. So it's a really difficult situation, but I think Red Bull have created this themselves. They've created their own problem. Now they need to find a solution. So I don't know what it is. Maybe it is a Hülkenberg. Hülkenberg doesn't have the Red Bull marketability. Does Alex Albon have Red Bull marketability? I'm not sure. Does Danny Kvyat? I'm not sure they do. So I don't think that's the biggest factor anymore. Gasly needs to go to Alpine, Renault. I actually agree with you. Who said that? John Norris. I agree with you, John. I think Carlos Sainz has shown that that's not a bad way to progress your career. Go as far as you can in Red Bull. Appreciate what Red Bull have offered Pierre Gasly, but if the Red Bull racing outfit is not the right fit for Pierre Gasly, maybe he needs to go elsewhere. And it's proved that Carlos Sainz has managed to make that work for him. Right, let's see what else we got here. Why does Alex get more criticism than Seb? I don't think he does. I'm not actually criticising Alex. I think he deserves some criticism this weekend because I don't think Alex performed well enough. He made too many mistakes. I mean, look, he flat spotted his first 2 sets of tyres. That's just a driver error. That's just a driver mistake. You can't afford driver mistakes like that. And then the one where he got his penalty, again, it was a rookie error. So you can't go around making that many mistakes. So I think even he'll be the first to accept that he deserves criticism off the back of this weekend. When it comes to Seb, Seb made another unforced error. He spun the car, of course, this weekend. That's been going on for a long, long time. I don't buy that Alex Albon has been making mistake after mistake after mistake like Seb has over the last couple of years. I think Albon just hasn't managed to get the performance out of the car. So I think there's two very different things. So I'm not sure that we're criticising Albon more than we criticise Seb. I think that's an unfair criticism. Nico Rosberg to replace Paul di Resta on Sky. Or both. Do you know what? Nico Rosberg, by the way, if you're watching on Sky in the UK or around the world, I think Nico has been the best addition to Sky's coverage, I think, ever. I think he's great. I think he's a brilliant, brilliant pundit. He offers really valuable, relevant, recent experience. He's not afraid to go in hard on anybody, on a guest, on his fellow pundits. He's brutal at times, but he asks the right questions and doesn't tiptoe around. I really respect what Nico Rosberg is doing for Sky. I think they need to have him every race if they can, because whatever they need to pay him, he's worth it. There we go. Which one can handle a twitchy Red Bull better, Hulk or Checo? Says Burnt Schenkius. Well, I don't know is the answer to that. I mean, my gut feeling would say Hulk, but I think if it was Checo, I think either of those two are both very good, experienced drivers, but I'd probably go with Hulk if it were down to me. But there we go. Right. Nico's great on TV and YouTube. He is. I've seen a few of his YouTube videos, actually. He is very good. I really think he's found a little niche for himself in all of the different things that he's doing since he left the sport. He seems very happy and he's got a lot to offer, so respect to him. Let me see. Right, let's go on to the next question. Okay, we've got... Oh, hang on. Let me find it. This one here from Neil Roberts says... with FP1 pretty much pea-souped out, it got me thinking, what if this was race day, where the medical helicopter couldn't take off before a wheel had even been turned? How would it be recorded for the season's record books? That's a good point, Neil. So I know the answer to this because we haven't had it before, but it's been close before, particularly in Japan a couple of years ago. And the answer to that is that if we'd gone through the weekend, let's say, and had Friday practice and had qualifying, then the event would be classed as an event. So the Eifel Grand Prix as an event would have happened. The qualifying records would have all stood. So, you know, a pole position for Valtteri would have gone down as another pole position in his record books. But there would have just been no records for race day. So nobody would have got an extra start on their records. Kimi would not have taken that record for the most starts, of course. But the event would have been established because they'd gone through the point of going through qualifying, and that triggers essentially that the official records stand. It's just that there would have been no race starts, no race finishing positions, obviously no points awarded, but in the record books it would have gone down as the Eifel Grand Prix weekend. So there we go. I mean, I'm pleased it didn't happen, but having a race at the Nürburgring this time of year, it was definitely a possibility. Nico for Mercedes CEO. Yeah, not sure about that. Oh, by the way, did you see, interestingly, as an aside, that I saw over the weekend that Ferrari, Matteo Binotto, said that they had essentially used their veto power to stop Toto Wolff taking the role of CEO of Formula One, which I thought was really interesting. Controversial. I mean, their argument is that he's a current employee of Mercedes, and therefore, you know, he has a vested interest aside from the fact that he's got shares in the organisation. So him becoming the CEO the CEO of Formula One would have been a massive conflict of interests, as opposed to the guy that has got the job, who is, of course, former Ferrari team principal. Now, I know that sounds utterly sus, doesn't it? There is a big difference, of course, because there's a huge gap between what Toto Wolff is doing now and, of course, what Stefano will do has done between leaving Ferrari and taking over in Formula One. But I did think it was interesting that they effectively used their power of veto, because that hasn't been done for some time. at a time when they've only just renegotiated a Concord agreement to keep that power of veto. So I wonder what you guys thought of that, because for me it seems like a controversial thing to have used your veto powers on. Presumably if Toto had taken that job, he would have had to relinquish all contact and all vested interest in Mercedes. But you know, we've got plenty of other personnel working for F1 or the FIA who have very strong links to teams. Even Stefano Domenicali very recently said in the F1 podcast, Beyond the Grid podcast, that he will always have a soft spot. He will always be a Ferrari fan. He'll always have that soft spot for the team. So let me see what you think of that. And I know what you're going to think of that. FIA, Ferrari International Organisation, says Paulie. So Toto was actually interested in the job. This is official, says DS Queenie. I don't know whether Toto was interested, but I do know that F1 was interested in having Toto. He was officially approached, either officially or unofficially, he was approached for that role. That's why Ferrari felt they had to step in. The veto power is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Chris 1. Yeah, I mean, wouldn't Ferrari want Toto out of Marc? Well, that's another good point. Yeah, maybe that would have been a better option for them. Tom Winterbourne, that's a really good point. Perhaps Ferrari should have been screaming to get Toto into that role. Absolutely. Toto to Susie, says Fire Up. Yeah, well, so I think what's going to happen, and actually somebody asked me this question before, what's going to happen with, you know, why haven't Lewis, in fact it was you guys in the chat earlier, why haven't Lewis and Toto signed contracts yet? And obviously I don't have any inside scoop on this, but I think Toto, I don't think either of them are going to leave. I think Toto, there were certainly question marks about this potential role at F1, first of all. Now there's question marks of whether Toto wants to continue in his current role. I think he's been open enough to say that he doesn't. So I think he'll stay at the team, but I think he'll stay in a very different role, which doesn't require him going to every single Grand Prix like he does today. And perhaps sharing his responsibilities out that he currently has amongst a number of people. So change the model of how the team is operated. That's what's happening right now. That's what they're working on before he then re-signs a contract. And with Lewis, I think, I'm actually not sure of the reasons behind Lewis's delay. There must, you know, no, but none of us know, so there's no point in speculating too much. But I don't have any doubt that Lewis will sign a contract at Mercedes. It would be crazy not to take all of the records still left open to him that he's only really able to do right now in a Mercedes. It would be foolish not to do that. So I fully expect it to happen. Maybe there's just some dotting T's, crossing I's. I'm not sure. I don't imagine Lewis is squabbling over an extra, you know, £1 million here or there. I suspect there are things like merchandising deals, things like sustainability clauses that maybe he wants the team to agree to in his big push in his latest drive for that kind of thing. So there could be all manner of reasons for it, but I fully expect both Lewis and Toto to end up staying at the team. Lewis will stay if he wants to become an 8-time world champ, absolutely. And Mercedes will want him to do that too, because when Lewis, I'm saying when, because I think it's almost an inevitability, when Lewis becomes an 8-time world champion, he's going to do that in a Mercedes. So the publicity that comes with that, the achievement that is, also reflects on Mercedes. So they will want that just as much as Lewis does. It's also partly the reason why, behind the scenes, there is no way really they want Valtteri getting in the way of this. I mean, I don't think they've got that problem, so it's not an issue. But if Valtteri came out the blocks next year, Valtteri 4.0 or whatever he is by that point, firing on all cylinders and actually built a lead over Lewis, I think there'd be some twitchy bums at Mercedes because they don't want Valtteri getting in the way of these records that may well last forever. And they may well last forever. I know we said that when Schumacher set them, but now there's a push in Formula One to equalise the field. Things like budget caps and everything else to equalise the competitive order. So the opportunity for one driver to be with one team that dominates so much may well never happen again. So it's an important record. I think it's one that he's going to get, and I'm sure it's one that he's going to get with Mercedes. Bottas 11.9 after some software upgrades. Right, 8th world title and cash out. Well, we expect Lewis to sign a 3-year contract, which, you know, will take him obviously next year into the new car, the new regulations of 2022, which he will undoubtedly want to experience. Give him 2 years at that, and let's see where him and Mercedes sit at that point. There's nothing really to say he couldn't go on to take championships in the new era of F1 too, but maybe he'll have more of a fight in his hands. But he's also got plenty of other things outside of Formula One that to fall back on. It's not like he's going to be kicking around with nothing to do, is it? It's time for Marc to prioritise Hamilton for this season to secure that drivers' championship. I don't think they need to. I don't think they need to prioritise Lewis for that. That drivers' championship is coming, whether anyone else likes it or not. I think. Let me see. Right, it will be a 2-year contract, says Nutcracker. Well, I mean, it could be, who knows, we'll find out shortly. What about NASCAR? Are you talking about Lewis? That's Russell Begay. Don't know, not sure what you mean on that one. Could Red Bull buy and build the Honda engine IP, says Bustin' Babies. We talked about this a lot last week. Yes, they could. That is a definite possibility, but it's a hugely expensive one to do at this stage. And I still feel that their realistic option, their best option, is probably to go with Renault, albeit eating a huge amount of humble pie. Let me see. I've got a couple more questions. I've got loads of questions actually, but let me see if I can fire through a couple of more. Ray Galen says, I know it's impossible to predict, but what do you think? Did Ricciardo make a mistake by switching to McLaren, considering how good Renault is at the moment? Car's fast, reliability's good, engine competitive, future sorted, money's no issue at Renault. It's a good point. Renault have definitely unlocked some performance right now. McLaren in the last race, particularly this weekend, had a difficult weekend with a new upgrade that didn't work. But look, McLaren are also on an upward trajectory if you look at the last few years. So I don't think that Daniel Ricciardo will be regretting his decision. This is not a decision just for next year. This is a longer term decision, and McLaren are in the process of building something that's got the potential to be really strong. So are Renault. Let's not make any mistake about that. They have taken giant leaps forward. Daniel Ricciardo at the moment is the best thing about Renault. But don't forget, they've got Fernando Alonso coming in to take his place, who also could be great. And that's going to be the big if. What's Fernando Alonso going to be like in that Renault? I'd have loved to have seen a Fernando and Daniel Ricciardo together. What a dream team that would have been. But to answer your question, I don't think that Daniel will be regretting things at all. He's made the decision. He'll have taken time to make that decision, and he will stick by it, I'm absolutely sure. So I don't think that we should be writing McLaren off at this point. Renault are doing great, but I think McLaren, even if results this weekend didn't show it, behind the scenes, McLaren are moving in a really strong direction. Alex Whitehead says this, with the tweaks coming for next year to cut downforce from the 21 cars, will it negatively affect the balance a fair bit? Seemingly most of the cuts are coming from the rear, and will this affect certain teams more than others? Right, good question, Alex. So the changes you're talking about, in fact, I've got a picture here. This is what we're talking about. This is a split screen, if you like, between the 2020 car on the bottom and the 2021 car at the top, with the obvious difference being that chamfered trailing edge of the floor in front of the rear wheels for next year. That is what the FIA, or Formula One rather, have deemed to be the most effective, the most efficient way to cut the downforce and therefore reduce the speeds on cars that are getting faster and faster and faster on tyres that Pirelli aren't changing next year, that were actually designed 2 years ago to cope with the excessive loads that they're now seeing through the constant development of these cars, and therefore the greater speeds. Lap records being set left, right and centre, and the tyres, if they continue at that rate, won't be able to cope. So as you can see there, right in front of the rear tyre, that cutout is now going to be, or that floor is now going to be 10 centimetres narrower at the point just in front of the rear tyre. So in answer to your question, will it affect certain teams more than others? Yes, it will. And there are two reasons for that. First of all, that the regulation actually for next year just talks about that point in front of the rear tyre being 10 centimetres narrower, and it being a constant line from the front of the floor, as you can see, straight back to that point that's 10 centimetres in. So therefore, we have some teams with a longer wheelbase than others, and that means that if you've got a longer wheelbase, you're effectively losing more of your floor next year, because the start point of that chamfer is set in the regs and the end point is set as being the point right in front of the rear tyres. So if you've got a longer floor, you effectively lose more of it. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is the teams that run the high rake concepts, teams like Red Bull, like AlphaTauri and others, Racing Point, less so this year, but others as well. Those teams rely on all of those slots along the floor and the design of that floor to effectively seal what on their cars is a massive gap, isn't it, between the floor and the racetrack. If you don't have that gap sealed by powerful vortices spiraling along the edge of those, you effectively lose a huge amount of the performance of your diffuser. The flatter cars, the lower rake concept cars, they don't need, well, they still need to seal the floor, but it's a much easier job to do that because there's less of a gap. If you've got a high rake concept, you need to work really hard to seal that gap. And that part of the floor that they're taking away is really where much of that is being done, along with all the slots and flick-ups that go along there that are also being banned. So in answer to your question, to round this up tonight, yes, it will affect some teams more than others, and more likely than not, it's going to affect those teams that run the high rake concept more. It's going to hurt the teams that utilise that space more effectively and efficiently than others, and that unfortunately won't be a Mercedes, which is the bottom line. So this change that, you know, certainly wasn't designed to try and help Mercedes. It was designed to cut downforce in the most efficient way. Inadvertently, I think we have to assume, is going to affect the teams that are effectively not Mercedes, and therefore it's going to give Mercedes an advantage over the course of next year, which I'm sure is the last thing many people want to hear. Anyway, I mean, let's just see what you guys are saying quickly before we go. You're right, Free to Wheel says it is beer o'clock. You are spot on there, it is beer o'clock. And by the way, thanks for all the birthday messages last week, because I got a stack load of beer and lots of different selections of beer, so I am well stacked in the fridge, so it is beer o'clock. Anyone got anything to say on that? Unless they have the fins on the floor. Eric, don't know what you mean, sorry. The slots and these tyre squirt slots right in front of the rear tyres are also being banned. So it's all of that work that teams have spent a lot of time on is going, which means they'll have to utilise things like the leading edge of the floor and the barge boards and the front wing to effectively do that sealing job, but they won't be able to do it as well. Josh Smith still got 3 minutes. All right, you watching the clock? Right, listen, I am going to go. Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate all of your input as ever. Massively appreciated, genuinely taking the time to come and do this. Please do like and subscribe to the channel if you don't mind. I'd really appreciate that on your way out. Give it a like because it helps me out. And I'll be back next week with another one of these, of course. No race next week, so any questions, fire them in. Thoughts on Portugal? Josh Smith, good point. I started running around on Portugal today on the sim. I mean, I've actually driven that circuit in real life. If you don't know the Portuguese circuit, the Algarve circuit, you are going to love it. It is a roller coaster of a track. I've taken a video which I will put onto Instagram in the morning. So follow me on Instagram at F1Elvis if you're not already, and you will love this circuit. I put the camera on the front wing so you get the best viewpoint of this circuit just twisting up and down. It's awesome. You're going to love it. So keep an eye out for that. But in the meantime, guys, have a great evening. Have a great week. I'll be back at some point with some other nonsense. I'll see you then. Ta-ra, folks.